All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. I think you're in for a treat with the conversation that we're having today. Our guest today is Lianna Chong, and she is an organizational psychologist. She's a consultant, an organizational consultant, and she does a lot of work that for many of you who are in business and in leadership, you would resonate with her work anyway. But recently, she started doing work in this space and in the area of spiritual abuse. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about how she got into that. We're going to talk about her work. But again, a little bit about Lianna. Lianna is an organizational psychologist who is passionate about helping others. She works with teams and organizational leaders. She educates caregivers and talks a lot about things like compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, which is something we're going to be talking a lot about throughout this year. And she does a lot of work to help people create organizational cultures of resilience. Now, Lianna, I'm going to let you tell people a lot more about you because you are an adjunct professor. You do a whole lot of other things, but now you're actually doing this work to help churches, to help pastors, and specifically to help spiritual abuse trauma survivors sometimes just make sense of what they've went through. So thank you so much for joining us today. And why don't you tell the Church Disrupted community a little bit about who you are and why you're doing what you do now?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for having me. So, yes, as you mentioned, I'm an organizational psychologist. That means that I look at issues from a perspective of human behavior. How do we tend to behave and respond to things, as well as systems? So, what happens when people organize into groups, into organizations, into institutions? And looking at how we can make these institutions be the best that they can possibly be. I believe personally that everyone deserves to walk into a workplace that is healthy, where they can thrive, where they can put their best foot forward. And the research that I've been working in around psychological safety, which I'll talk more about, that shows that when people feel safe and in a positive environment, they actually do their best work. And so teams and organizations perform better when we have this condition of psychological safety. My background also includes ministry. So I have a master's in theological studies. It's not an MDiv, but I worked in campus ministry for many years. I worked as a lay leader in my church. So the church is very much my home, so to speak. And this project that I'm now embarking on sort of brings it all together.
Yeah, you're a bit of a unicorn, I think, and I say that in like a really good way, but you have this deep understanding of psychology and also a deep understanding of theology and a background of work in the church. So, it's always funny. It's really easy when we come to talk about spiritual abuse for pastors and church leaders to just kind of poke holes into whoever is blowing the whistle or whoever is doing the challenging. But I think it's unique from you that your background shows you care about people, you care about leaders, you care about the church, and you understand this. You have been in this world. It's one of the reasons why I do this podcast. People can push back against me, and pastors do often. But at the end of the day, I'm a pastor like them who spent 17 years in local church ministry. I love the church. I still go to church. I'm still very involved. We have pastors on our board. So it's one of those, if you can push back, but not like you could push back against maybe all other people, right? But still, and I want you to think about this because you're in such a unique position. And this is what I was thinking about as we were getting ready for this podcast. Church leaders often struggle, like I said, to listen to whistleblowers, and we can frame people. And I say that as we, because I've done it. We can frame whistleblowers and people who challenge us as people who are just malcontent. They're just dangerous. So like when you listen to whistleblowers who say I've experienced spiritual abuse, I'm walking through religious trauma. Well, a lot of times they get labeled as things like divisive or gossipers, and they get framed as malcontents. If the spiritual abuse comes from former pastors or current church leaders, a lot of times they get framed as, well, you're just bitter, or you're just lashing out because you didn't get something the way that you wanted, or you're jealous, or you're angry. But many church leaders today, I would say from my experience and in a lot of big church, mega church, and you and I are a little bit of kindred spirits because before I started this work, I was a consultant. So I had been a pastor, but I was also a church consultant and a leadership consultant, working with businesses and churches, right? And a lot of pastors and church leaders are enamored today with organizational psychologists, with consultants, because they see you as someone who can help bring them growth and who can help their
Mm.
culture get better so their bottom line gets better. And so there's an appetite, I think, for pastors and church
Mm.
leaders to bring in people who do what you do and really begin to listen because they see you as someone who can help them bring business principles, right? And good growth principles into what they're doing. So, how do you feel like your unique voice in this season is allowing you to speak into churches and church leadership in a way that maybe somebody like me or your everyday person who's blowing the whistle on spiritual abuse could?
Well, one of the things I've come to realize is that my background and my training in organizational psychology gives me a lot of tools and lenses and frameworks to view the kinds of issues that we're seeing in the church around abuse. So, for example, how groups organize to scapegoat when there's information that comes out that the group or the people in power don't like. How do they respond? And a lot of these things happen on levels that people aren't aware of. So I think bringing more awareness through these lenses of psychology is something that can really speak into the church to help them understand, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? Why do people resist change? That's a huge one, I think, that comes into play when these scandals come out and in all of the things that are done to try to suppress it, because people don't want to face information that will change their status quo, their life, their position, their power, their relationships, their normalcy. So what they do instead is they try to make that information go away, or they try to pretend that it isn't there. But what you might know, Jeff, as a former consultant or maybe current consultant, is that when you're brought into an organization, you're often brought in because there's a problem. Something has gone wrong, there's something that they have tried to tackle that they realize they need help. And as an organizational psychologist, what I try to do is get to the root cause of whatever discomfort, distress that an organization is experiencing. If you don't get to the root cause, then whatever you do with that organization, it's not going to produce the change positively that they are looking for. So it's just like a doctor going in and saying, well, let me give you some pain medication when you're having a heart attack. If you don't address that root cause of that heart attack, the body will continue to suffer. And this is what I have seen in these systemic responses to spiritual abuse.
Yeah. No, that is so good. And have you found, because this has been a lot of my experience, especially doing church consulting more so than business. Normally, when businesses bring you in, it is a little bit more of, at least from my experience, okay, something has to change or some heads are going to roll, so we're ready to listen a little bit more
Mm,
than maybe in churches. And
mhm.
I've done both. The cultures are just different, right? Have you ran into leaders, especially in the church, that maybe they have a problem, and their problem is, well, we have been growing for 10 years straight, and now all of a sudden we haven't grown for 2 years straight. That's a problem. That's a problem
Right.
because our model is we need to grow. But when you begin to work on those root causes, well, let's dig deep into what's causing that. um, have you experienced people who give you a lot of pushback and say, well, we don't want to deal with the root of the problem. We just want to start growing again? I have experienced
Definitely.
more of that in the church than not. So,
Mm.
how have you experienced that? And what can we learn about that in church leadership, whether that's lay church leaders, whether that's pastors, where we can really begin to listen and focus on the things that are most important instead of hiding them under the rug? Because when we push them under the rug, they just tend to grow under the rug until they can't
Exactly.
fit under there anymore.
Yeah, right. It doesn't solve the problem. And I think that's one of the things to emphasize when you're working with a leader. I've personally seen it both in the secular world and the faith-based world. And I think that's a lot because of what I do is around psychological safety and, diversity, equity, inclusion. So things that make certain people uncomfortable because they challenge a status quo. So anytime that you're doing that, you're going to see a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance because you're pushing for a change that is actually shifting those power dynamics in a certain way. And sometimes you don't realize that a leader is not open to change until you're way into it. So they might say like, yes, we value this. We want you to come in, do your assessment, do your training. And then, in the middle of the training, you bring something up or you encourage the participants to chime in with what they have to say about things they've noticed that are a problem, and the leader shuts it down. So I've seen that happen. So a lot of the work around changing organizational systems is actually working on helping the people in power and leaders embrace change. So as an example to that, I think that, whenever a leader receives feedback, that can feel very threatening, especially if it's something that they're not doing well or should be doing better. So how that leader responds to that piece of feedback, they can either, become defensive about it, and then they're not processing what you're trying to tell them if they're in their defensive mode. So it's really about helping people step down and say, let's try to listen to what is being said. Let's take the personal aspect of it out of it for a minute. And let's also talk about feedback in a way that this is actually a constructive process. So the end goal, where we're headed, is somewhere better, but it's going to take some hard work to get there. And some of that hard work involves looking inside, especially as a leader. So that's really hard to do, Jeff. And I think, not everybody is in that place and able to do that. And so then that's a decision that, that community, that organization or church is going to have to make.
Well, one of the things I say often is that listening is a spiritual superpower, but it's an often neglected skill. It's an often neglected, I believe it's a part of the fruit of the Spirit. When you look at how is the fruit of the Spirit that we have listed in Galatians, how are they fleshed out? I don't think you can live those out without listening. So we encourage people who are trying out new churches, especially after they've been through religious trauma, to really look at how well leaders listen. And we encourage leaders to listen really well. I think my most quoted verse is James 1:19. When dealing with pastors online who get upset about something that we've said, is, hey, can we start again with a little more James 1:19? Can we just, can we be curious and have a conversation before either person gets upset at the other? Because it's really easy to get upset about something that is challenging. It's much harder to listen and say, why does this person feel the way they feel? Is there a place where I even could be wrong? And I've experienced that I think the church leaders who are in the healthiest place are the ones that can ask the question when they think this person's off their rocker, they're absolutely completely wrong. They don't have, they don't have the information that I have. I know I'm right. And even when they feel that way, they can still ask the question, but how might I be wrong? And what impact would it make if I'm wrong? That's really hard to ask. But when leaders ask that, I think it disarms everything and it brings us to a place of being able to learn. And if nothing else, empathize with people who have been hurt and been traumatized, even if that's not what we meant to do as church leaders. So I want to talk about church responses to spiritual abuse, because they are really bad, and they're really, you can guess what's coming next in most of these church scandals. If you watch them for very long, it's a playbook, and it's a playbook that's not working. So I want to talk about those. I want to talk about how to recognize spiritual abuse and what the most important elements of spiritual abuse are for us to recognize, how we can respond to those. because Lianna, I know there's a lot of people who experience spiritual abuse, and for years they waffle back and forth was that really spiritual abuse, or am I
Yeah.
just overreacting? And it makes it impossible to heal until you can tell what really happened in your story. So I want to talk about all those things. But before we jump into those, I really just want to hear from you, and without using names of any churches or anything like that, how does an organizational psychologist who loves the church and is in the church get into this space of, now I'm doing work and creating assessments and creating tools, which we're going to talk about later, to help combat and recognize spiritual abuse? What moved you from, a career that already seems very solid to now doing this work in this space? Because what I know, no one gets into the space of working within spiritual abuse and religious trauma unless they've gotten close to it and seen the damage
No.
that it does, because it's too painful otherwise.
Unfortunately, that's true, Jeff. So, in my case, it was a situation in my church that I had been a part of for 15 years. And what happened was there was an allegation of spiritual abuse by an associate pastor of the senior pastor. And watching the process that unfolded in my church, the initial minister who raised the allegation was fired. A group within the church tried to ask for an independent investigation and more transparency. The church leadership responded by basically attacking the people who were trying to raise these concerns and saying they're out to divide the church or to slander the senior minister, or all of these sorts of things. And what happened was the entire congregation became bitterly divided over this issue. So you had
So
some
it sounds
people.
like anybody who brought something up, whether it was that original pastor on staff or people calling for an independent investigation, anybody who brought something up or said there might be something here, they got attacked in whatever way was available to almost cause the most pain. The pastor who brought it up losing his job causes a lot of pain. Labeling people within your midst who ask for an independent investigation as divisive and gossips also brings a lot of pain. So am I hearing that right? That was just kind of the response of, let's attack and cause pain to anyone who pushes on this?
Absolutely. Um, and worse. And so what happened was, first you had a group of people on the inside trying to raise these concerns internally. And with spiritual abuse, what's hard is that it's usually only a select group or even one or two people that actually see what's happening and experience this other side of a person. So that's why I think it's very similar to like covert types of abuse, covert coercive control, because a lot of times these types of abusers are really good at putting on a different face when they're in front of the whole church, or when they're in front of the board of elders, or when they're in front of the people who have the ability to hold them accountable. They make it hard to believe the folks who've experienced abuse. And then the burden shifts onto them. So what happens is, as you were saying, when you're experiencing spiritual abuse, it's a very confusing process. It often takes place over, months or years, and it gradually builds. You sort of give the benefit of the doubt, over and over again, or give someone another try. And eventually you realize, no, there is something very wrong here, and it's not changing even with feedback. And so then, you have this tremendous burden of trying to explain and almost prove that you've been spiritually abused. And that burden should not fall on the victims who've experienced it. And
And not
so,
only should the burden not fall on them, but they're having to prove it to people who don't want to believe it, because we don't want to believe that our pastors and these people who care for us, we don't want to believe that they're doing things that could cause harm. So you got this person carrying a burden they shouldn't have to carry, and they're trying to convince people who from the beginning are kind of like kids with their hands in their ears, because human nature is we don't want to believe bad things about people we trust.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And so, you're really like stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what I saw was truly a systemic failure, that it wasn't enough when people told their stories of abuse. It Our church did not go through a proper procedure of a truly independent investigation. They brought in some outside groups. They came to a conclusion that supported the leadership, and essentially the people that disagreed fled the church, and it's effectively becoming a church split. And it's just been so painful to see, because you have, not only individuals who've suffered a lot of trauma. That's something I saw, physical, emotional, spiritual, relational breakdowns from this traumatic experience. But you have, former long-term friendships that are bitterly, bitterly against each other now. And so for me, again, going back to what I do, I'm looking for what is the root cause here. If you're not addressing the root cause, it's not going to get better. So when you see like the conflict is only ramping up, it's because something important that needs to be addressed is not being addressed.
Hey Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. Well, we've all heard the phrase, time heals all wounds. And I talk about this a lot, especially with our table groups and groups of people I get to do one-on-one work with. We're going to do a podcast on it soon. But the truth is that time doesn't heal all wounds. Time only heals wounds that have been treated correctly, right? That have been taken care of. If you haven't treated that wound, time isn't going to heal it. It's going to fester. It's going to get infected. And actually the wound is going to grow, the pain is going to grow, and it's going to get to a point to where it could actually kill you or do irreversible harm. So in the church, we've really got to get to the point where we throw away that idea that time heals all wounds. The only way we heal wounds is we have to respond correctly and treat them early. And especially when it comes to scandals, and we're not getting into responses yet, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but when it comes to church scandals, we tend to want to just put a Band-Aid on it, give some ibuprofen, and move on and tell everybody it's going to be okay, right? We don't want to say, how do we treat this wound? How do we stitch this wound? Okay, maybe we didn't treat it well enough. It's not responding to the treatment. We need to do something different, something more invasive. We don't want to do those things. And because we put Band-Aids on the root causes that you're talking about for so long, I believe that's why spiritual abuse and church scandals are so rampant right now. I was telling you before we got started about a research project we recently did where we looked at and really investigated the systems around 100 churches who have faced recent scandal. We got most of the 100 churches in the past 2 years, and it wasn't difficult. That's how many scandals we're having now. But that is happening because we put Band-Aids on for so long that now these Band-Aids, they're just falling off, and we've got these exposed wounds that are killing people and can't be ignored, right? I also think, and this is the sad reality of spiritual abuse, okay? Nothing will turn a close friend and family member into a bitter enemy more
Mm,
than an allegation of spiritual abuse that is unchecked. It's not
mhm,
investigated, it's not
mhm.
corroborated because we so deeply don't want to believe that our spiritual leaders that we've trusted with our spiritual lives could be bad, could be doing these things. It's easier to turn against a lifelong friend, and it's easier to turn against a family member who you are supposed to love regardless and cut off communication with them than it is sometimes to push for truth and transparency in churches. And I think that's one of the most damaging things I've seen, Liana, and we hear it so often. One of the most damaging parts of spiritual abuse is the relational shrapnel, the
Mhm.
relational damage that is done um, with people who weren't a part of the abuse. They didn't experience the abuse. They're the people you think will listen to you most. And instead, too often, they actually attack you the hardest. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, from your perspective as someone who understands how teams and groups of people work together, why is it that people who are supposed to love us and we're supposed to be able to trust so easily can turn to an attacker who says, I can't be in a relationship with you anymore?
Well, I think it's, as you said, we don't want to believe that about our faith leaders, but we also don't want to believe certain things about ourselves. So when someone comes to you with an allegation of spiritual abuse, you're looking at the situation and you might say, well, he doesn't seem that way to me, or I've never experienced any of these kinds of behaviors. And we don't want to believe that we could be that wrong in our own judgment because that's unnerving to think that we can walk through the world and think we know someone and think we've seen who they really are. And they could have a whole other side to them that is
If I'm
hidden.
wrong about them, what else am I wrong about in my life and faith?
Yes, yes. So I think that is very difficult for people to step into. I think another thing is truly just fighting to preserve something, not wanting to see your church, your community fall apart. But the sad irony of that is that by not acknowledging the source of the hurt, you are actually inadvertently, unintentionally contributing to this breakdown of your community and this body. I mean, I think that cases of spiritual abuse should be one of the times when a congregation bands together to say, let's figure this out. Let's support each other. And if something needs to change in our leadership, let's take that on. Instead, it becomes this very divisive force because people don't want to change. The church, especially, there's, tradition of 2,000 years that, we're fighting to preserve certain aspects of it. But just like you said with that analogy of the wound, so the analogy I like to use is doing any sort of change process in an organization is like a home renovation or construction. So, first, you take down the walls. And then you may find out that there's a pipe that is leaking, or you may find faulty electrical work that has been there for years and years and never dealt with. So you have a decision to make. Do you plaster over it and ignore it and pretend it's not there? Or do you dig in and actually fix what's underneath? So if you don't fix those problems that are underneath, they're going to become bigger and much worse problems over time.
And it's so much easier. And, I hate to bring this up because we don't like to think about this with the church, but it's so much less expensive to just replaster over the wall and act like that faulty
Yeah.
electrical's not there, to act like that leaky pipe's not there until we have to deal with it. Right. And I think about situations like, and this is on public record, but the Robert Morris scandal from last year,
Mm-hmm.
you find out that people knew about what happened to
Mm-hmm.
Cindy Clemenshire. Elders knew about what happened, yet they ignored it and ignored it and ignored it until it was impossible to ignore. The
Mm-hmm.
pipe had burst, everybody knew, and then the majority of that elder board just walks away. Um, you know,
Mm.
Robert Morris walks away, he's removed, but he didn't have to experience all of that pain. Who is left to experience that pain? And this is what's different between the home renovation. In the home renovation, when you cover it up, you're the one who has to deal with the pain. In a church, we're all a part of that family. It's often the leaders who at that point who caused it get removed and go somewhere else and do something else. And it's the ones who did not cause the issue, did not
Yeah.
make the decision. The victims themselves are experiencing more and more pain that they didn't cause. And I think for me, when I look at spiritual abuse, oftentimes the greatest damage and the greatest trauma actually comes from the second wound. It's not
Hmm.
even the original allegations of spiritual abuse, it's how they were responded to
Hmm.
when a person gets the courage to bring them up. And one thing I tell churches a lot, Lianna, is if we will learn to respond in empathetic, loving, and fruitful ways to spiritual abuse, where we care about the truth, we care about the victim, if we would respond well, we would save people from a lot of trauma. The trauma's
Yeah.
coming because we respond so poorly, and
Hmm.
and it really makes a victim question everything they knew, right?
Hmm.
So, how do you see that second wound? Because you see a lot of
Hmm.
churches responding to these things in poor ways. How do you see that second wound of poor church responses affecting spiritual abuse victims in ways that can stay with them for years?
Hmm. Well, there's a term called institutional betrayal, and I think it really resonates with what people are experiencing in the church. And that's where there's an institution, a group that is supposed to be charged with protecting you or taking care of you or having your best interests in mind. And then when something comes up, when you've been harmed or wronged, they behave in the opposite way. So they protect the abuser or they discredit you or they do not listen with that kind of empathetic openness that we're talking about. And so when you experience that institutional betrayal, I mean, it tears apart so many layers of our experience, our identities. You know, if we grew up in the church, if the church was a place that always felt safe until a situation like this happens, it makes us question everything. It makes us question the role of a faith community. It makes us question God. You know, where's God in all of this? So these types of situations are having such negative effects, not only on people, personal well-being or relationships or communities, but also existentially and in terms of how we relate to God. And that's, see, to me, that's the opposite of what we should be doing in the church. We should be bringing people closer to God and not putting them through these kinds of situations that make them question their faith, God's love, God's presence in their life.
That's so well said. And it just makes me think, when you talked about Liana, it becomes an existential trauma almost. This is
Yes.
affecting us on an existential level. Now, when we face trauma, like something happens, you face trauma in a car wreck. It may always affect for the rest of your life the way you approach riding in a car. There's a trauma
Mm-hmm.
response to riding in a car or certain situations. I had before spiritual abuse, I already had PTSD from
Mm.
growing up in an abusive environment, right? So there are parts of that. There are things that happen to me in life that will always bring that trauma back up and cause a trauma response. I have to learn those triggers. I have to learn how to deal with those. And as a 39-year-old person, I'm still learning to deal with things that coping mechanisms I picked up, trauma responses I picked up as a 7 year
Mm-hmm.
old, right? But let's think about how much different is trauma. And this is why spiritual abuse and religious trauma to me is so incredibly dangerous. When you experience institutional betrayal, what you just talked about, when we experience that in other institutions, it's like experiencing different levels of trauma. So
Okay.
I have trauma with certain institutions, certain business practices, certain people. When we experience it with the church, institutional betrayal doesn't feel like institutional betrayal because how do we describe the church? It's the family of God.
Mm.
It's your church family. So I wasn't betrayed by an institution and its systems. I was betrayed by the family of God, my brothers and sisters in Christ. How else do we describe the church? We describe the church biblically, as we should, the church is the body of Christ. Well, for a lot of people when they experience spiritual abuse, whether they want to admit it or not, they feel not like they were betrayed by an institution. They feel like they were betrayed by Jesus himself, because this is the body of Christ. And then there's guilt for even saying that, because we know it wasn't Jesus. And people are
Mm,
telling us it wasn't Jesus. And now, if we say things like that, am I questioning my entire faith? Well, then I can't pull on those strings and I can't deal with that trauma, or my whole faith may crumble, right? So it's not institutional betrayal so much. It doesn't feel that way. It feels like family betrayal. It feels like we've
mhm,
been betrayed by God. And then we begin to look deeper at the trauma. What does that cause? It causes existential trauma. I'm asking questions about God I never thought I would ask. I'm asking questions about my church and the faith I never thought I would ask. Well, now I don't just have trauma every time I get in a car. I don't just have trauma when I experience those things. Existential trauma leads to trauma responses as we exist, as we
oh,
live, as we breathe, as we walk. And all of a sudden, you find a person who says, I don't feel like I can go anywhere or do anything or go a day doing any normal things without these trauma triggers and responses coming up. And I don't know why. They feel like they can't move. They feel like they can't breathe. And no one has ever seen them and taken the time to see them the way that you just did, and to say, that spiritual abuse you went through has caused an existential trauma, and therefore it's showing up as you live and you move and you breathe and you exist. And we see you and we want to help you heal. And we're going to be really patient with you, because this has affected so much of who you are, your identity, and your life. And I think if we could just, as people in the church, not even leaders, as people in the church, we could be empathetic witnesses that respond to someone's experience and existential trauma that many of us, until you've experienced it, you just don't know it. If we would have empathy to say, I want to understand what you're feeling and how I can support you, the trauma would not last as long. It wouldn't go as deep. But that continued betrayal, and again, I'm rambling a little bit just because I feel like this is something that we don't put into words, and I think you just gave us words, and that was
mhm,
such a gift.
mhm.
Um, what we what we now know is institutional trauma. Why did it hurt so bad? Is because it felt like it was our family and our God and our faith, our own faith, that betrayed us. And that takes a lot longer to walk through. Spiritual abuse can be really hard to recognize. Do you think that's a part of why it's hard to recognize, and why we fight recognizing it and labeling it for what it is?
There's a lot of reasons, I think, why it's hard to recognize. But if you don't mind me going back to one thing, is that, you mentioned it feels like Jesus. And I had this conversation with a group of survivors coming out of my church. Jesus experienced this. How was Jesus treated by his own family and in his own hometown? He was driven out. And he said it is harder to preach the truth to your family and to your hometown than anywhere else. So as painful as it is, I think Jesus is right there in it with us. He knows, he understands intimately how painful these experiences are to walk through. And remind me of your other question again, Jeff.
Yeah. I just want your thoughts on why you think it's so hard for people to recognize spiritual abuse, because often it happens for a really long time before we recognize it. And when we do recognize it, we want to call it something different. We want to soften it, because spiritual abuse, religious trauma, those things sound so they sound so hard. So I'll find people who are just starting to really engage in healing steps years after spiritual abuse, because it took them so long to recognize it, and then to be able to be honest about their story. So yeah, I would just love your insights into why is that, and as part of that institutional betrayal and that kind of existential trauma.
Yeah, and it's a very painful process to walk through, to begin to realize that this is something you've experienced, and it's more damaging than you probably realize when you're first setting out. And that's an awful realization to have. And nobody should experience this at all, let alone in the church. Um, so I think that, part of the reason why it's so hard is that, especially in what I've witnessed, it can be very, very subtle and come on very gradually. So we might have in our mind a picture, an idea of what an abuser is like or what a bully is like. And probably in our mind, that person is, very kind of overtly um, critical and bullying and intimidating and threatening. And they're this presence and they yell and they throw things. And, there are certainly those types of abusive people in the church too. But there's also this kind of more subtle and manipulative kind. And you really don't realize that you're being manipulated until much further into the process. So one of the traits of abusers is, they try to bring people in the beginning. They try to ingratiate themselves with you. They tell you you're special. You're not like the rest. You're my number one. And then they use that relationship and that loyalty, and they gradually start, upping the control. And in our situation, I think a lot of people who are in the situation didn't see that it was abuse until they started speaking up about it directly. So until they were the one to ask questions or, challenge or just wonder about a decision that was made by leadership, they didn't see that other side come out for themselves. One thing that I did with a group of folks coming out of my church is I sat down with them with the power and control wheel, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a tool used in domestic abuse situations. But it has all sorts of different categories and examples of how abuse comes out: economic, coercive, using other people. And even though it's intended for a relationship, it translated to almost everything that these people had experienced with this leader. And so we went through the wheel and we were able to say, if we see this kind, we see that kind, we see that kind. And I think that was probably the first aha moment for some of these individuals to realize, okay, this is actually abusive. And if you're not trained in that, if you don't know how to recognize the signs, it's very hard to see. Or it's easy to excuse certain things that were said. Oh, he didn't mean that way. That wasn't his intention. I'm sure, it was a misunderstanding. I just happen to be trained in some of this language and these tools due to trauma and due to, personal things that I've seen and walking through situations with people. And I knew some of the signs earlier than others. So again, I think helping people be able to recognize those signs at an earlier stage, we can save them from that much deeper, longer term trauma that becomes institutional, that becomes existential. Also, I think as a community of believers, clarifying when a religious leader tells you this, that's not from God. That's not what the Bible says. And unfortunately, a lot of Bible verses are used and twisted, right, for abusive purposes. And so helping people see, who God is through his word and his scriptures, who Jesus was, how he behaved. Did he do these types of things? Would that be okay with him? And so, that's what I really hope that we as a larger community of believers can push into in this next wave of understanding spiritual abuse in the church.
Well, there's a power in the earlier we recognize it, okay, the less damage it's done and the easier it is to respond to. But, I love, what was the tool again? What was the name of the tool that you
It's
used that
called the
was
power and control wheel.
the power and control wheel? Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of those kind of tools. When my therapist first introduced me to a feelings wheel, to an emotions wheel, that was a game changer for me. So I want to look that up, and I'll do my best to link that. So if you have one that you think is really great to link, let me know, and we'll link that for the listeners. But there is a lot of overlap in the way spiritual abuse looks because it's so relational, and the way like spousal abuse and
Mm-hmm.
domestic violence would look. There's also a lot of overlap in how narcissism shows up in Christian environments and church environments to the way it would show up between two spouses. And when you think about a narcissist, and we've had Chelsea Brooke Cole, narcissism expert, on multiple times, but she says most narcissists, even the grandiose narcissist, it's hard to recognize that they're a narcissist because they are it, kind of at a root level, they're impressive people who do a lot of
Mm-hmm.
good things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it's why would someone marry a narcissist? Well, they didn't know
Mm-hmm.
they were a narcissist before they married them. They didn't know those signs to look out for. And because there's
Mm-hmm.
so much good, you overlook the bad, right? But the closer you get to a narcissist, the more you begin to experience the pain. Yet, especially in like marriage relationships, it's I'm willing to overlook it because I know who they really are, or I know all the good things. So if they were just the loud bully all the time, it would be easy to recognize. The problem is a lot of these spiritual abusers are narcissists, and in churches, a lot of them aren't even grandiose narcissists, they're covert narcissists. It can be very difficult to see what's going on. And of course, people who aren't super close to them, right? If you're not in their inner circle, you're not going to see a lot of that. And when you are in their inner circle, they usually have dirt on you. They have
Mm-hmm.
some blackmail on you. And as bad as I hate to say it, it's part of the way the church system too often works. And I had Tim Ross on the podcast, and we talked about it. Talked about the amount of pastors he's seen where other denominational leaders were trying to get dirt on them because if
Mm-hmm.
we don't have dirt on you, we're not going to promote you, because that's how we all keep each other in check and keep these things hidden. So, um, talking about how difficult this is to recognize, you're doing a study. We're going to talk more about that here in just a few minutes, but you're doing a study right now. You're working on a validating an assessment that helps people to recognize spiritual abuse. When you think about spiritual abuse, you know, often I'll ask people, hey, how do you define spiritual abuse? Instead of asking you that, I want to ask you, what does spiritual abuse look like? What are the most common elements you see that, again, maybe don't feel so dangerous on the front end and are hard to recognize? But for you in kind of everyday church environments, what does spiritual abuse look like? Can you give us some of those elements and help people just to recognize it?
Sure, sure. Um, there's a lot of complexity to it, but I think some of the themes that stood out to me, one was, if you disagree with me, you're oppositional. So that is this idea out there that if we are disagreeing with our leaders in the church, we're all of a sudden against them. And that was kind of a question I had early on in watching, things at my church is, well, why is that? Why does that have to be the case? Why can't we have good, earnest discussion about things that we have different perspectives on? And all of a sudden it becomes this personalized thing. Loyalty is another big one, and I think this is co-opted by a lot of spiritual language of submit to your leaders, respect your
Spiritual honor,
leaders.
have an honoring spirit.
Yep. And so what these types of leaders do is they take that idea and they translate it into this kind of unwavering and unquestioning loyalty where you can't even, have a different idea than your leader without running it by them first. So I think that's one of the hallmarks that I've certainly seen, as well as, a lot of emotional abuse, which is hard to recognize and hard to understand when it's happening, but things like, if you do this, if you speak out this, it's going to be so hurtful to this person. And that's such a hard one because even people who are trying to speak out about abuse, we still care about our leaders as people. We still care about their families if they have a family. But then that gets used to silence people. Controlling, who you can talk to about what is a big one. And it can start off seeming, justifiable or somewhat normal, but then it kind of creeps into this place of, I'm not allowed to do certain things or just to talk to certain people or to say certain things. And that's dangerous territory when you have a leader that is restricting people's ability to speak openly and freely. And then another one is, unfortunately, the culture of the larger church is a big contributing factor to this. So it's not just the leaders and their enablers, but it's how do the people of the church respond when these types of allegations come up, and seeing things like, well, we don't talk about things that our leader did or said because that's gossip or because that's disparaging them. So if we can't talk about some abuse that happened, how can we hold leaders accountable? So essentially, it's these things working in combination that sort of set up this perfect storm for abuse to continue, to get worse, to go unchecked until it erupts in some of these horrible scandals. And frankly, causes so much more damage to the reputation of the church and all of the things that folks are trying to fight to protect. We're actually making it worse. We're losing trust of people. How do non-believers look at the church, right? Their trust in faith leadership has declined monumentally. And it's not because there's a few bad actors. There's always going to be a few bad actors. It's because of the systemic nature of how it's handled when it comes up, that it's suppressed, that it's enabled, that it's excused, that it's justified. And that's what we need to change in order to protect people and in order to show the world who Jesus was, who his values were, what he stood for. It's not what we're seeing in these situations in these churches.
Yeah. No, and there's things like loyalty sound good. Things like honor and trust sound good. They're biblical ideas. Unfortunately, when it comes to spiritual abuse and hiding things that shouldn't be hidden, these biblical ideas take on new definitions that are not biblical definitions, or even really English definitions. The amount of people who accuse what we do on the podcast, they'll accuse us of gossip. And often I just have to say, I'm not convinced you understand what gossip is. Let's just dive into it. Like, what actually is that? Because we got this idea that it's something different than it is. Loyalty looks like, I remember that, there's a church that I was a part of that were caught in lies about and false statements about why a pastor was let go. Okay. I was a part of that church. It wasn't about me, but they were caught in lies about why this campus pastor was let go. And when people at the location started questioning them, they gave a statement. It didn't line up. People knew it was lies. They started questioning them. The number one answer that the pastor and the elders and kind of support that he brought with him, the number one answer they gave to people is, if you trust pastor, then you don't have to ask that question. So really, do you trust him or not?
Trust
and now
us,
they make it not about a lie. Hey, we're trying to hold you accountable because this isn't true. This doesn't make sense, what you said. Now it becomes, well, do you trust me? God put me in this place. So if you don't trust me, you don't trust God. So really, this is a trusting God faith question. Do you have faith or not? Well, most people are going to back off of that because, again, now that's an existential question. And I think something that's come up time and time again, Lianna, in this conversation today, I want to highlight. We as humans, and I want to see if you agree with this, and if you disagree, please feel free to push back. I think we as humans, though, tend to have, from a psychology perspective, a really hard time holding two truths in our hands at the same time. Okay. That feels like it's pulling us in opposite directions, especially in our current Western culture. Yet the truth is, two opposing, seemingly feeling opposing things can be true at the same time. Yes, this person is good in a lot of ways. They've done a lot of good things, and my faith wouldn't be what it is today without them. And they're doing abusive things that they should never do to anyone, and they're not owning up to them, right? I
Absolutely.
think about, my father, and I experienced, different levels of abuse with my father. Today, my father is in prison. Two things are very,
Mm.
very true. I love my father. I wouldn't be the man I am today without my father. And I desperately wish I could have had a better relationship with my father. I love him. I pray for him. And he will never be a part of my family's life likely again because it's not safe. And the things he's done are not safe, right? Those two things can be true at the same time. From a psychology perspective, why do we struggle to hold things in tension like that seem like they're opposed, but they're not? Because I think if we could do that, blowing the whistle on spiritual abuse would be easier. But we feel like if there are abusive traits, if things are going wrong, then everything we knew about them was wrong as well. And that's just not the case.
That's true, Jeff. I think if we could solve that question, we would solve quite a lot of the human condition. It's just easier to understand all or nothing thinking. It's hard to acknowledge and accept that somebody could be so different to one person than another person, and that could be held together. But also, aren't those types of conflicting areas the same about God, right? How can God be all knowing and give us free will and the ability to make our own decisions? There's so many contradictions if you look at who God is. And so it makes sense that we as people were made in his image, we're made like God, we're full of contradictions. And helping people see that that doesn't mean that you have to hate the person. It doesn't mean that the good things that God did in that person weren't good, or it didn't come out of a bad situation. I think God can bring a lot of good out of the worst situations in our life. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that if we're minimizing the harm that this person caused, if we're excusing it, if we're allowing them to continue in powerful positions unchecked, then we are actually starting to enable this abuse to continue. What's the loving thing to do? I think that's another really good question for the church. And people think loving someone and protecting them means you don't bring these things up. But I know as a believer, at the end of our life, every person's going to stand in front of the Lord and have to give an account of their whole life. And so I think the loving thing to do is to say, hey, we see this problematic pattern because we all have blind spots. We all sin in ways that we can't see. We depend on each other to point these things out because it's ultimately God who holds us accountable for them.
It's really easy for us to quote, "For we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God," until it becomes a spiritual abuse allegation against a pastor. And then we haven't all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, or we forget that in that same book of Romans that there are consequences to sin. And that even though God forgives sin, he doesn't remove all the consequences. So what we do, matters. And I think going back to one thing that would help us so much, people get so upset when I talk about this, but if we were more biblical literate as Christians, it would help us a lot, because a lot of the tradition we're trying to protect are changes that we made over the years to make the system more comfortable over thousands of years, not necessarily what Jesus said, what the biblical writers said, who they were. Going back to even that idea of when someone accuses you of gossip, well, what would people have heard when someone talked about gossip in the first century church? What
Right.
does gossip mean today? Is that the
Yeah.
same way that we're using it? And sometimes just some simple questions like that can totally turn our paradigm on its head. But again,
Mm-hmm.
it goes back to, can we hold that intention? Can we let our
Mm-hmm.
paradigm be challenged without our faith being challenged? So I think they're important questions to ask, but fair warning, they are, for those of you that are listening, they're uncomfortable questions to ask. Lianna, I want to talk about this project you're doing right now. I think it's going to be massively helpful. I think it's going to be a game changer when you reached out to us and said, hey, I would love to partner in different ways in the future. But I'm doing this project. I loved it because we do a very specific type of research at SAI, and a lot of our projects are about to start coming out. But our research is very much so applied and investigative type of research. We're looking for real solutions right now. Okay. There's also a need for validated tools and assessments. There's a need for academic research that is peer reviewed in the world of psychology and how people handle trauma. All of it's necessary. We're trying to focus on, hey, how can we stem the bleeding right now of so many people being hurt? How can we do that? And I think yours does a great job of bringing all of those things together. You're working on a validated assessment that is going to help people and churches identify spiritually abusive environments. Tell us about what you're doing and how you foresee it making an impact in the church.
Yes, Jeff. As we've been talking about, it is so difficult to pinpoint spiritual abuse when it happens, even to yourself at times. And so, through seeing this happen in my own community, it led me to first look into what is the research that is out there today. Then I quickly discovered that there's really not a lot of it yet, especially published academic research. There's some really great books that have been coming out, I think, that describe and help people understand spiritual abuse better. But what happens when a case of abuse comes up? And it tends to become this he said, she said thing. The people who speak out about abuse are blamed and discredited. And everyone in the community has a hard time seeing the truth, right? So creating this assessment is something that I wanted to do to help people see from an objective lens. If you're looking at a church or a Christian organization, what are the behaviors that an abusive system would do that a healthy system wouldn't do? And I'm looking for the visible stuff. So it's like the tip of the iceberg. The abuse is happening underneath. Not a lot of people are going to see the nitty gritty of it. But there are patterns of abusive leaders. There are certain things that leaders do or say, and churches and institutions will sort of own that contribute to the abuse. So my assessment is going to look at 3 different areas. It's looking at psychological safety, it's looking at the culture of the church, and it's looking at the leadership. And in this assessment, I'm trying to cast a net. If you think about fishing, if you have a net with really wide holes, you're going to catch the really big, obvious fish, but the little ones are going to get through. So the process of validating this assessment, of getting hundreds and hundreds of people to respond to it based on their experiences, I'm looking for the lowest common denominator. I'm looking for those behaviors that are the most ubiquitous, that make that net as tight as it possibly can be, so that at the end of this process, I'm able to say, if you take this assessment and you score this, we're confident that there's abuse happening. If you score in the middle range, maybe it's unhealthy, maybe it's bordering abuse, maybe there's some happening that we're not catching. If you score in the upper range, this is a healthy system and environment, and the likelihood of abuse happening is very, very low. So I'm hoping that at the end of this process, people will be able to use this tool for a couple of purposes. One, for their own understanding of their situation. If they're one of those folks who are walking through a situation in their church and starting to ask questions or feel like something's not quite right here, they can take this assessment and get an idea of, where does this fall? If you're a member of a church and an allegation of abuse comes out and you're wondering, how can I determine, whether this might be a valid allegation of abuse? Because that's a really big concern, right? Taking this assessment will help you be able to see, even if you didn't experience the abuse yourself.
Yeah,
So
it's
by
almost a
looking,
question of how likely is it that these allegations would be true in my culture? How likely is it the
exactly.
spiritual abuse could happen? So maybe even would I be correct in saying that maybe even it hasn't happened yet, but it's likely to happen or not likely to happen based on the range of these scores?
I would agree with that. I would say, I'll have to do all of the statistical analysis to figure out the ranges, but there's probably going to be a range in which, abuse is most likely happening, a range in which it could happen or it may be happening, and then a range where it's most likely not. So it's also a way that people can assess a church or an environment for how healthy it is overall, right? So if you're looking at going to a new church, these are really good questions to ask and to answer. If you're in your own church and you're starting to maybe wonder, is this really healthy? I don't know. I never really thought about it this way before. Taking this assessment could help open, your eyes to some aspects of the system or the culture that are setting a dangerous precedent. Like you said, that abuse, is more likely to happen if this is in place. And the psychological safety piece of it is really important in that regard, because psychological safety has been studied extensively in the secular world, and it's been linked to cases of improved outcomes in healthcare. So lives are actually saved when a healthcare team has psychological safety. Engineering, if you think of some of the biggest disasters that we've seen, Boeing and the sub recently, and even going back to NASA and the Challenger, these situations can be traced back to cases where information and discussion about risks and about, problems was not open, um, where people were silenced when they tried to speak out about their concerns. So it's happening all over the place. Google is another one. They did a study on what makes their best team successful, and psychological safety was the number one factor on what makes their team successful. So the fact that we haven't yet studied this in terms of the church is significant. And I think that it's going to be highly related to abuse. We're going to be able to use psychological safety as a predictor for whether abuse is happening.
Well, I'm just guessing that was kind of the hypothesis behind the research. Now we're fleshing that out. Oddly enough, and this is one of those things that can cause cognitive dissonance. I'm a big believer in psychological safety. Read a lot of information on it, yet the way I was introduced to psychological safety was at the Global Leadership Summit when it was still helmed and led by Bill Hybels, who turned out to be an incredibly abusive leader, right? Which is,
Wow.
again, it's just a reminder of
Yeah.
two things can be true at the same time. That was good and led me down a road that helped me to actually it was a speaker, and I can't even remember the book, but it was a speaker who had a book about psychological safety and those studies that led me to realize, oh, what I'm going through is not just a bad season. This is spiritually abusive and has been for a
Mm,
while. So I resonate with your work because if it wasn't for understanding psychological safety, I wouldn't have realized how bad the situation I was in actually was, and it would have done a
mm,
lot more damage. So I am hyper
wow.
grateful for your work. I know you can't share, exactly what you're measuring yet. I know you can't share the findings because you're still in the middle of this study. Um, and I don't know that you're in the middle of it. You're actually in the second stage of it, if I'm correct. But we want to help you. The Church Disrupted community wants to help you because, again, our listeners are a whole lot of people who really do want to make a difference in this. How can they help you with this study and help you to really tighten up that net?
Great question. So yes, right now the survey is open for participants. So you'll go through a screening to determine if you're eligible. And eligibility for this study just means that you have had some direct experience with Christian leaders, whether that's in a church, whether that's in a Christian organization or another type of institution. But you have some sort of direct experience working with or alongside of these people where you've seen some of these behaviors for yourself. And so, provided you're eligible and you give your consent, then you can help by answering these survey questions. So, in phase one, I tested about 60 survey items. It's down to 31 in this phase, as well as a couple of other survey measures that I'm going to be testing my survey against. So the survey itself takes about 10 minutes to fill out, and we can link up the web link for you to go fill it out if you're interested. But through this process, I had 400 people participate in round one, and I have about 230 in round two. So I'd love to get up to 600 responses for this final round because I just want to make sure that I'm catching everything that I possibly can. I'm not missing it. No stone is unturned.
Well, and especially when it comes to not only academic research, which you're doing, but research for assessments and validated assessments is really its own animal from even just, academic research, because when tools come into play, there's a different process. So the more of our listeners who can actually take this survey, the more it's going to help Lianna to get this validated and to get the best results to help the most people. Again, you don't have to be a pastor to do this. You can just be someone who cares about creating safe churches and helping people heal from spiritual abuse. So we're going to link it we're going to link the survey and how you can take that. Again, it only takes about 10 minutes. We're going to link that in the show notes on every single platform, in the description on YouTube. We'll also try to just put the link right here on YouTube. And then if you're watching social media, we're going to share that, Lianna, on Instagram this week for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. We'll share it on our Instagram. We'll share it on TikTok. We'll share it on Facebook, and try to get this in front of, at least 50,000 people if we can. And hopefully, out of that, we can get you the numbers that you want. If there's a number that's too much, I'm assuming you'll just shut it down so it doesn't get overwhelming. But I am asking you, if our work at Church Disrupted and SAI, if it's impacted you positively, I believe in this work. I believe in this assessment. I believe in what Lianna is doing. So if our work has impacted you, would you take 10 minutes at no cost other than time and fill out that survey, because it is going to make a huge difference. I know we're asking you to do a lot of different things for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month, Spiritual Abuse Awareness Weekend, asking your churches to sign the Church Safe Pledge. This is the lowest risk, easiest thing that you could do. And I know what we're asking you to do is a bit more uncomfortable. So if you're not sure, hey, what can I do for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month to make a difference practically where I'm at? Take this assessment. That is the first step. And it is going to help, I believe, millions of people just because you're given that response. So please, from the bottom of my heart, I'm asking you, would you go take it? I'm taking it. And we want to help Lianna and other people like her to create really good tools like this. And Lianna, I want to say this. We're trying to figure out right now with SAI, we have our niche of what type of research that we really want to focus on, because we want to be taking actionable steps, creating actionable resources to stem the bleeding right now. We want to balance that with contracting with researchers and people who have a lot of experience in the academic world to do very specific academic research on kind of the psychology and trauma side as we go. But as you know, those things get really, really expensive. So the budget is just not there right now. So one of the things we want to do long-term in the middle and right now to stem that gap is to support people who are doing great research of types that we're not doing. And not only support them, but to share their research. So when this is done and you have your findings, we want to share them on the SAI website. Not only that, I'll do kind of a review blog that just says, hey, here's what I think we can learn from this, what I think we can understand. We want to put great research from great people and great practitioners in front of people. It doesn't all have to be our research, but we want to be a hub that says we want to get great information out. So when that's done, you let us know when we want to get this information and the assessment, once it's validated, in front of as many people as we can.
Thank you, Jeff. I definitely will. I'm excited to share the results of this with everyone. And one of my goals is to make this survey publicly available and free for use for any individual to go on a website and take the survey. I also am planning to build a publicly accessible data bank. So if you consent to providing your data, we can actually start looking together at some of these trends across the church, both nationwide and international. I've had multiple international responses already on my survey. So you don't have to be in the States. You don't even have to have experienced spiritual abuse or an unhealthy church environment. I need people to fill out the survey who are part of healthy communities too, because we have to show that the opposite is true if you're healthy. So whatever your experience is, taking this time is going to go towards a vault of research that will continue developing our understanding of what healthy environments look like in the church.
Yeah, so no matter how good or how poor your experience has been, your input is going to help. And anytime we do a study, if we're just studying spiritual abuse victims, we're only going to learn about spiritual abuse victims. We're not going to be able to validate it or compare it to the other side and learn the holistic lessons. So again, please take that, Lianna. We are so excited to share it. Before we jump off the call today, though, why don't you let our audience, people who want to follow along with not just this project, but more of your work in general, how can they keep up with the work that you're doing, and how can they support you?
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm starting to write on Substack. My Substack is goodshepherding.substack.com, and I am working on a book as well. So if you subscribe to my Substack, whether a free subscriber or you're able to contribute, that is how I am funding my work right now. I view myself almost as a missionary of a different kind. I'm dedicating my time and my effort to this issue because I've seen how much the need is for people in the church. And I do not want to see more people harmed by these kinds of behaviors continuing unknowingly. So please check out my Substack, and there's a website that we'll be posting for the survey as well, where you can follow along with the progress of the research. And you're always welcome to reach out to me as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Send us all those links so we can put them in the show notes. And again, Lianna, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the work you're doing. Looking forward to the book, everything that's coming out. And thank you just for your vulnerability. I said it at the beginning. I'll say it again, though. You have to have really come face to face with the damage done by spiritual abuse to do this work, because it's not easy. And I know that as you're doing this work, it's not been easy for you. So thank you for sharing not only your time, but your vulnerability and the courage to share your story today.
Thank you, Jeff. It was great to be here. I loved our conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.
Yeah. Well, we'll try to have you on when you have the findings and just talk about the findings and the research study. But I hope you've learned as much as I have today listening to Lianna. This was a fantastic conversation. It's got me excited about the future of the church, because the more people who are waking up to the reality of spiritual abuse, the closer we get to healthy churches that show people Jesus more than introduce them to trauma. So I'm so excited about that. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast conversation and all of the conversations that have come this week. I know that we're doing a lot right now. We'll slow back down after Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month is over, and we got some incredible guests that are coming up that you're not going to want to miss. But I hope this one blessed you the same way that it did me. But that's it for this episode. We'll see you again on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. But until then, grace and peace.